You deserve to give yourselves a big round of applause for being a great audience. Uh, we are prepared to continue with our Safe and Just Community Summit, and I want to thank all of you who have traveled here from the borough of Brooklyn, the borough of Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, Jersey, Long Island, Chicago, D.C., L.A., or way down yonder in New Orleans, my beloved hometown, but I live here now. Let me, first of all, express again my appreciation to John Jay and the Vera Institute. Give them a round of applause for their collaboration in connection with this ongoing conversation about safe and just communities. And when I say the beginning, it's the beginning, meaning this summit is the beginning of our effort to push this conversation even further. And it was great this morning, of course, for me to be in conversation with Leader Jeffries and to hear his thoughts and his perspectives on the issues we're discussing today. I do want to say, before we begin, that the case of Jordan Neely has struck a nerve, rightfully so, with people not all over New York, but once again, all over the nation. And once again, our eyes do not lie. And the 21st century technology of cell phones and the ability to record these interactions gives us all a chance to exercise reason and judgment with respect to what occurred. I want to be clear. The position of the National Urban League is that the perpetrator should have been arrested 48 hours ago. And that if circumstances had been different with respect to the race of the victim, we would have seen an immediate action by law enforcement in this city. We believe that there should not only be an arrest, but a thorough investigation. And based on my long experience as a lawyer, someone that led a city, that oversaw the most successful police reform effort anywhere in America in the 90s, we will not rest until charges are brought and justice is done. And I encourage all of you to join in that cause and in that call for justice to be done in this instance. We can't come here and have this conversation today without dealing with the immediate, real cases that are happening on the streets of this community. To do so would be irresponsible. To do so would be ducking and dodging. To do so would be to live in the intellectual ionosphere. And we want to live with our feet on the ground, with our hearts and minds tuned, and with our discernment of justice intact. So I wanted to say that before we begin these discussions, because all of these discussions about policy, about how we navigate, are only as good as our efforts to execute and implement them. Policy is not a piece of paper. Policy is not a beautiful document. It is how what is on that paper is applied to human beings and human interaction and connectivity. So violence in our communities takes many forms. I want us to continue to center our thinking on a North Star, and that's peaceful, safe, and just communities. Say peaceful. Say peaceful like you mean it. Peaceful. Safe. And just. And they go together. And those that try to say they're separate and distinct don't share our North Star for our communities. So when we talk about addressing community violence, it is not just about the response to, it's about the prevention of. My final point, and there's a discussion about mental health, which is an important discussion in this country. But there's also an argument of diversion taking place in this country. And that is when we say gun safety laws, some say it's a mental health problem. Why is it that other nations have mental health challenges like we do, but don't have 50,000 gun deaths a year? It's because of the easy, unproliferated access to guns in our communities. I can get a gun in New York City, Chicago, New Orleans, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, faster than I can get a lollipop or a popsicle. It's just too damn easy. So I offer those to frame and set up a very important discussion, and I am excited that Amy Solomon is here and Carol Mason is here. Give Carol Mason a big round of applause. She's the leader of this institution. But Amy is going to moderate this panel with some dynamic panelists, and hopefully we'll have a chance for some audience interaction. But Amy Solomon is the Assistant Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, and is charged with strategies and execution to address community violence. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Amy Solomon, and she'll introduce the panelists. Thank you very much.
the Executive Director of the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention. We've got Sam Vaughn, the Deputy Director of Community Services in the Richmond Office of Neighborhood Safety. I believe it was the first one of its kind. We've got Sasha Cotton here of John Jay, Senior Strategy Director at the National Network for Safe Communities. And finally, we have A.T. Mitchell, who's the founder and CEO of Man Up, and was also recently appointed the Gun Violence Prevention Czar for the city of New York. All of these individuals have decades of experience, not to age anyone, but a depth of experience and are wearing lots of hats. So I'm going to ask them, starting with AT, to take a minute or two to introduce yourself more deeply, what brings you to the work, and then we'll go into our questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope no one falls asleep, considering we're following lunch. But it is a pleasure to be back here at John Jay. Thank you, of course, to John Jay and to all of the co-sponsors of this summit. It appears to be an amazing beginning of some robust conversations. I'm A.T. Mitchell, as been mentioned. I am a proud New York City resident, so I welcome all of you here from other cities, other states. I am, as been mentioned, the founder and executive director for a community-based organization here in New York City called Man Up Incorporated. And it is now, next year, 2024, will mark 20 years. We are a 20-year young grassroots-based organization. Thank you for that, because it is indeed an accolade that is well-deserving. And I'm joined by so many of my colleagues. And 20 years in grassroots organizing and working and running a nonprofit is not an easy task, considering the public sector. So for me, it's been more of a calling. How did I get into this work? I'm coming from communities in Brooklyn and Brownsville and East New York, like type neighborhoods, growing up in those communities, and really not understanding why my neighborhood was the way it was and the conditions that we had to endure, but learning that it was, something that most others that can relate to poverty and all those other ills would have to experience. And so it was no different for myself. Having found myself, unfortunately, charged with a crime I did not commit in the mid-'80s and was convicted and sentenced to prison and released in the early '90s. I knew that my experience was something I didn't want to see anyone else endure. And so I hit the ground running, and from then on to this day, I've been a community organizer, been an activist. And unfortunately, 20 years ago this year, in November of 2003, an 8-year-old named Deshaun Hill was shot and killed in my neighborhood of East New York. And although I was doing all that I could prior to, I learned that I wasn't doing enough. And so out of which, working with the family, working with the community after that tragedy, my nonprofit was founded. I decided to run and direct my own nonprofit, and for which I've been doing so every day since. And out of that work, getting into community violence, addressing community violence, and being an advocate, we've been very vocal about it, been working around alongside so many other great organization leaders and so many other different activists. We've been able to sound the alarm here in New York City and be able to partner now with so many of you from throughout the country on strategies and models that work, and we've been able to implement our own crisis management system model here in New York City that is leading the way in this work. Yes, down the road. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I'm astounded by the number of people in this room. It's very exciting. I'm Fatima Loren Dreyer. I'm Executive Director of the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention. I'm really grateful to be on this panel with people I deeply respect and to talk about this work, the evolution of community violence intervention and where we are now, where we're going. So the HAVI helps stand up hospital-based violence intervention, and I'll spend some time in the next round talking more about that. But how I came to the work, I think similar to many, many people in this movement, comes from lived experience. My father has been in and out of prison most of my life, most of his life. He had a gun put to his head when he was a child, and those sorts of things are common in my community. My family's experienced homelessness. we've seen it all, and it becomes normalized. This is just how it is. And it wasn't until, I, as a young adult, cared about community development work, wanted to do economic development work, trying to go back to places that others wouldn't, realize that we couldn't talk about economic prosperity without addressing violence, right? We couldn't talk about health without addressing violence. There are all these things that we want to live healthy, whole lives come down to how safe do we feel in our neighborhoods. And it thwarted me into this work. I'm a trauma therapist by training. I also have an MBA from Yale, right? Because the notion is, how do you scale healing, right? How do you bring the work we know and we can do with one another to scale, make it part of the system? You have to have both sides of the brain operating to do that. And I'm so excited because as much as there's wisdom on this panel, there's wisdom out there, and it's going to take all of us to do so. So thank you for being here.
Definitely hard to follow. Yeah, please. So my name is Sam Vaughn, City of Richmond's Office of Neighborhood Safety. And I literally came to this work because no one else would hire me. Spent 10 years in prison for manslaughter, had skill set, had baggage. And that's the day that they were continuing to punish folks for their bad decisions and the mistakes that they made. And so I literally I could not find a job. And this office had just opened up. And as Amy said, it was the first of its kind in this nation. And so it was like my resume was my life. And it blew my mind that everything that I had gone through would make me valuable, especially to government. And so I had applied to try to do lawn care for the city because I was a heavy equipment operator by trade before I went to prison. And they wouldn't trust me to run a lawnmower, but they hired me to take care of someone's mind and soul. And it just didn't make any sense to me. So I'm grateful we're in a place to where we are now, where folks have gone through their experiences and that experience is valued and people see them for who they are and not the worst decision that they made. But we definitely still have a lot to do. So I'm grateful to be here. I know by the standards of the values that the majority of this country holds, I shouldn't be sitting here. But despite that, I am, and I will continue to fight that good fight until the good Lord says otherwise. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Really hard panel to follow on introductions. I'm Sasha Cotton. I work here at John Jay College at the National Network for Safe Communities. And prior to that was the director of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention during the time when George Floyd was murdered and the following unrest. So bring that lived experience to my role at John Jay. What brought me to the work, I think like most of us, is living in a Black body, living in a Black woman's body, living in Black and brown communities. I was a young parent and also a victim of violence myself, and I apologize, I'm a little hoarse, but I'm not contagious. It's not COVID, it's just allergies. But I always say I had family on both sides of the equation. I had family who were cops in the criminal justice system. I actually went to school to take over my uncle's law practice. That was my trajectory initially, but also always had folks in my family and my life who were systems involved and really felt compelled to deconstruct that system from the inside out. I started my profession in corrections and worked inside of the Minnesota prison system with a real passion because I had a cousin who was inside those walls for wanting to deconstruct those systems and make them work for our communities. We know that our correction systems don't do anything to correct, that they are mostly about punishment, and that doesn't make our communities safer. And so most of my journey has been about healing community and looking at systems reform and how we can work inside of government systems in particular to make our communities safer. I often think of myself as a double agent, someone who can sit at any table and represent our people at tables they don't even know exist and represent our needs and do it with grace. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'll talk a little bit more about the National Network next round.
Great. Thank you all for bringing to the story what brings you to the work, and it's clear even from these introductions how much expertise and different perspectives you bring to the table. A.T., I'm going to start with you. Talk to us a little bit more about Man Up, the intervention that you launched, and what some of the key elements are of the strategy and what you see working on the ground.
So at Man Up Inc., again, just to follow up behind the death of the 8-year-old Deshaun Hill and his family, unbeknownst to a lot of people, there were 3 children that was possibly injured in that incident. Unfortunately, one did, pass away, but there were 2 surviving children, a 5-year-old child, boy, and a 4-year-old, his little sister. So it was 3 children that could have gotten injured. And so for me, being the committed person that I am, I just dedicated myself. When I met the family, it just was really connected. I knew how, maybe some of the things they were doing, but I wanted to help. And so when it was time for family to go back to work or school, as it is for many families that ignore this thing, after all of the hoopla and all of the lights and cameras, the reality settles in, then it was a decision that had to be made about who was going to babysit these other children. And so if you can imagine, if you almost lost all 3 and now you had 2 surviving children, for that family, they were ready to let their jobs go in school. And I offered myself up and I said, what I will do for you is this, mother. I will personally pick the children up from public school, and I will watch over them until you all get home from work and school. And that's how Man Up Inc.'s after-school program began. And I believe my approach is dealing with the children first, and we service as young as 4-year-olds at Man Up Inc. And the babies are able to come to us after school for a number of hours, and we're able to help them, get them, refreshments and with their homework and things like that. But I believe that, from there, everything else began to, kind of grow. We do a lot of work at Man Up Inc. There's other orgs here that's in the audience, my colleagues in this work. I'm sure that they can relate to the work that we do. But now we're more famously known, not for the youth development work, but more for the violence interruption work that we do. And so we, in 2008 and 2009, we adopted a model that was in Chicago at that time, called Ceasefire Chicago. And we adopted that model, and we, pretty much we've been doing it every day since. And out of that, we've been able to now even grow it even more. In New York City, we put it on steroids. And we've been able to have a lot of our other city partners engaged in helping us be able to help these neighborhoods that are stricken with violence. So we are a multi-service agency, but we start with the young, and we work our way throughout the family from just dealing with the children.
And you've been evaluated too, yes, by John Jay.
Thankfully, yes, which, the evaluations is what really drives this conversation home. Because of all the work that we do, without data collection, without evaluations, without it being proven as something that works. We were blessed, I believe it was 2017, for John Jay, I see Jeff Butts present and his team, to actually evaluate our work on the ground. And it came through, and it was a blessing, because now we've actually, in New York City, prior to, there was evaluations of the work elsewhere throughout the nation, but never like in New York. And actually it was synergy in the outcomes in terms of the work and the cure violence model on the ground in certain communities, i.e. like East New York and the South Bronx, that has been evidence now that it does reduce violence. So yes, so thanks to John Jay for their evaluation help.
Great, thank you, A.T. Fatima, I'm going to move to you. We've all heard too many stories of gunshot survivors being further victimized in the hospital right after. You have expertise in hospital-based interventions. Can you talk to us about the work and the role of the healthcare system in CVI efforts?
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about it from 3 different perspectives. And then I'm going to start with the story, actually, and then talk about the 3 different pieces of the work. So hospital-based violence intervention actually goes back several decades. So it's early work. We find ourselves in Oakland. There's a young man named Sherman Spears who had been shot, was actually paralyzed from the waist down, and was in a hospital. And folks were coming to his bedside like, we're ready to retaliate, right? What do you want us to do? And and then doctors and nurses would come in and be like, how are your wounds? And he's like, this is ridiculous. They have no idea. I'm actually trying to stop people from, he told people no, like don't retaliate on my behalf. And folks in the hospital had no idea, right? He was doing that from the bedside. And so as he was healing, he was going through a lot psychologically. And again, folks were coming to his bedside to say, how are your physical wounds? Then they sent him back into his community, right? And he's like, no, he negotiated to get back into the hospital, and he would go to people's bedside, right? And say, I come from your community. I know what you're going through right now. There is another way. Let's do it together. And so born was the hospital-based model. So it's a bit of a misnomer, right? Because the hospital is the access point, but the resource is the community, right? The resource are folks with lived experience who come to the hospital, sit at bedside. They're part of the team, and follow folks post-discharge, right? So it's also about community work. So that's the birthplace of the model, and we are the organization that helps stand up this work nationally. We're in 85 communities and growing, and there is a lot to this. We're part of a larger ecosystem. So for a long time it was, all right, it's either cure violence or you got the hospital-based work, you got the we are all brothers and sisters in this, and we need to be coordinated, right? So that's a huge piece of this. So the first piece of hospital work is what I said, the access. There are a lot of gun violence that doesn't show up in police reports, right? So I was recently met with the CDC, and they shared with me that in Atlanta, they found 80% of the violence that happens in Atlanta does not show up in police data, right? It's in the hospitals. They found it in the hospitals, right? There's a huge gap in what we know, and hospitals have a resource. So there's something for us to learn beyond the access to patients who've experienced violence and that repeat victimization. There's also knowledge we have in the aggregate about where violence is happening and how that we can access. Finally, there's an opportunity to think about systems change in new ways, right? So we talk here about reimagining safety in communities, and it does include engaging other systems, healthcare, education, right? We know that, we say that, but how do we call people to task for that? How do we engage them? So some of the work we do at the Javi is thinking about, well, who else can be paying for these things, right? So we have also launched policy work that has Medicaid, right, healthcare system pay for credible messengers to do their work as a legitimate part of the healthcare infrastructure. So we were the first to introduce violence prevention professionals, just like doctors, nurses. They are part of our healthcare code, right? We did that. And now we go to every state and say, now you gotta reimburse, just like you do for doctors. Our credible messengers need to be reimbursed. We've gotten 5 states to agree, and we have a bill right now in New York, okay? We're working on this everywhere, because once you become, it's an unlimited resource, right? I'm not saying it's the only resource. Feds, we still need your resources, right? But it's about diversifying how we do this work, how we sustain this work over time. There are other systems that have a role to play, and we're really calling the health system to task to be a part of our safety infrastructure. I'm also pleased to say I now lead the Kaiser Center. Kaiser Permanente is a big health system like Northwell Health here in New York. Kaiser's in other markets like Northern California, DC. Kaiser Permanente committed $25 million to looking at education and research, and we now lead the research center to help scale this work. So we're really excited about all the different ways. There's a lot of need for research. Some of the most cited research on hospital-based work found that it reduces violence significantly. People are 4 times less likely to commit a violent crime, and reductions in terms of incarceration rates. But that work we need so many more RCTs that are ethically constructed. This work is very expensive to do, and so I'm very excited and very grateful for the partnerships we have, and we need to do more.
Thank you. I don't know how you do it all. That's a lot of hats. I'm glad you raised, though, the Medicaid opportunity, because it's a game changer. And I would just say there are things that we're going to raise, and we have resources to point to, some of them, webinars that exist, that have been held, that will be held. So we'll make sure that the organizers have that information so you can access that. Sam, I'm going to turn to you. We already referenced Richmond. Was it 2007?
Correct.
The first Office of Neighborhood Safety. Tell us a little bit about your intervention approach, the Peacemaker Fellowship, which has been a model for so many other jurisdictions since then, and what makes that intervention strategy different, and what roles can local government play in really seeding this work?
All right, that's not a lot to answer at all. So yeah, the Office of Neighborhood Safety opened its doors October of '07, first Office of Violence Prevention in the country. As you stated, dozens more have opened up since then. I think there was a really large gap in time. Very proud of the work that we've done. I believe that the numbers that we have created in Richmond when it comes to gun violence and the reduction of gun violence helped push the envelope politically for other jurisdictions to try to justify spending tax resources in this way. But I haven't really found another office in the country that has specifically just been designated to gun violence, and I think that is an issue. And when we look at a lot of the other offices of violence prevention around the nation, and they aren't seeing the reductions that Richmond has seen, and good people who have sacrificed a lot to try to do good work in their communities are being blamed for it. Like they have directors of offices around the country getting fired because gun violence doesn't go down, yet you didn't give them the proper tools to reduce gun violence in that community. And so we're being cheated, to be completely honest. And so when you have the office in Oakland, for example, a huge amount of resources in that office. But they also deal with domestic violence. And then they also have some weird earmark that they're also supposed to be responsible for closing cold cases. So how does that fit? And so one thing that I know local governments can do if you're going to open up an Office of Violence Prevention is let it be what it needs to be to prevent violence. And so we were very, very lucky because we had a council that was reimagining public safety back in 2007. And so they let us specifically, sole purpose, reduce gun violence. And we don't know how the hell you're going to do it. We're just going to leave it to you. And they did. And they allowed us to get creative. And so when people say the Operation Peacemaker Fellowship is a model that people across the country are looking at, it's actually across the globe. There's people in Kenya, there's people in London, there's people in Colombia looking at this concept. And it's basically just loving on folks who don't nobody want to love on. I mean, as simple as that. Like we look at these individuals who are at the center of and most impacted by gun violence in the community, and we're saying they're the problem. Well, no, they're the problem created them, but they're not the problem. And so when you start looking at them as an asset, like you cannot reduce gun violence without partnering with those responsible for gun violence. You're just not going to do it. And when you try to work around it, and the folks who are next to them, and let's try to take care of their nephews and their little brothers, and this will just work itself out. Like, I mean, I don't know how long people have to sit back and watch people die in our communities, but that is not going to be the response to solve it. Prison isn't going to solve it. Police are not going to solve it. These individuals are the only ones that will solve it. And they're not even part of the equation in most communities. And so what we did with the fellowship is we identified those most responsible. And it's always a small amount of folks. I mean, at any given time, there's 100,000 people in Richmond. At any given time, there's 3,000, 4,000 guns walking around there. Of course, easy. Like everybody feels unsafe. But it's only 30 or 40 folks making them other 4,000 people want to walk around with a gun to feel safe. When you start dealing with that small group of folks in a different way, everybody feels safe. Now it's more of a hassle to carry the gun because I'm worried about police, not dude, because he cool. Like I seen him, all right on. And so we partnered with these folks and we call it a fellowship because we want them to feel important. We want them to feel involved. And we just showed them something different. You know, we showed them that they can be loved, that they are important, that we will provide resources. We're going to invest in you and love on you until you find it in yourself to start loving yourself. And then as you start loving yourself, you're showing folks, just like you influenced, I mean, these young people, they influence laws, they influence budgets, like they influence all kinds of things. Like now you can start influencing folks around you to do much better with their life. And the entire community benefits from it. In 2007, we had 285 shootings that led to injury or death in 1 year. To date, we have 8. Middle of May, well, beginning of May, but 8 shootings. 2 of those, sadly, were fatal. But 2 homicides in a city that's used to 38 to 45 every single year for decades. And all we did was just diverted some resources and some energy to the right people. Folks spend a lot of money on gun violence in this country. You spend it a little bit differently, you get a much bigger bang for your buck.
Thank you, Sam. Those are incredible numbers. Yeah. We held the first CVI conference last February, had 400 people doing this work in the same room. And what was so amazing is that so many of them have been doing this work in isolation. So many of you have been doing this work in isolation. And we're so hungry for some of these nuggets that you're sharing and some of these lessons and the best practice. And we've already used several times the word ecosystem, but our hope is really to be able to build this ecosystem so it's a stronger network that can take some of the lessons that each of you are bringing to this conversation. Thank you for sharing yours. So I'm going to turn to you, Sasha, and continue to build on this theme, not only with your hat and your seat here at John Jay, but also your experience in the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention. You focused a lot on building community capacity. How do you do that? And how can the public sector partnerships help equip communities to be better positioned to bring this strength to the efforts into their neighborhoods?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so inspired by the panelists, and of course I'm last, so I get to like borrow from everything that they've said. But, you know, first and foremost, the idea of offices of violence prevention, and we have to pay tribute to Richmond for that, is such an important part of building local capacity to address these issues. We know that local government is responsible for public safety. It's one of the key pillars of local government, but that often looks just like law enforcement in so many places. And I think building out offices of violence prevention is such an important part of building the capacity because we know it's through those offices that community is usually getting most involved. So I just want to name that first. And then obviously with the hospital-based work in Minneapolis, we were building hospital-based work as early as 2016. And I don't think I've ever shared this with you, Fatima, but the hospital that we started in is where I came as a victim of violence. And the service was horrible. They sent me home with 16 broken bones, right? And just so seeing that program come full circle is just an important earmark for me and how much the work has improved because of hospital-based intervention. But thinking specifically about Minneapolis, one of the things that we did early on as we were building out the office was to start a capacity building institute specifically for community members. I call it building the brilliance of Minneapolis, but it's really building the brilliance of community, right? We know that the community has the solutions, that the answers to violence rest with community and community partnership, but so often the brilliance that rests there isn't leveraged and isn't built, right? They have the reach and the relationships, but are often put to the side and not really valued and not built up in the ways that they should be to contribute. And so we started what we called the Blueprint Approved Institute. The Blueprint was our action plan around violence prevention, remains the Blueprint in Minneapolis, really focusing on people with limited capacity for grant management. What we recognized, or what I recognized early on when I was working in the office, is that we would have, you know, I'm from that community, guys will come in and say like, look, sis, I'm trying to get grant money to start this program. I'm already working with kids, kids from the block, but I can't get anybody to give me money. And we had traditional grants, micro grants, $5, $6, $7, $10,000 grants, but they went through a traditional city grant management process, right? And we know these guys who are coming from the block, who are just being released from prison, who have the reach to touch our babies who are at most risk or who are already involved in the violence, but they can't write a grant, right? That's not their skill set. We don't necessarily need them to be expert grant writers, but when they're competing with the YMCA and Big Brothers and Big Sisters, right, they're just getting blown out of the water for $6,000, which could be the difference between them being able to reach those young people who are active shooters or not, right? And so what we did was we reversed our process for grant selection. So for our micro grants, instead of focusing on people who got 7s, 8s, and 9s, we focused on people who got 4s, 5s, and 6s. We knew that people with like 1s and 2s just might not have the capacity to do enough to be involved with the city, but we knew those people in the middle, we could teach them how to manage grants. And so again, speaking back to this double agent piece, I also knew that it meant they would become a city vendor. They would be registered with the city to get grant applications in the future, right, moving forward, and that we could help them start their own 501c3 nonprofits. So I built a curriculum with our research department and the health department. We were baked into the health department, and that year we selected 6 agencies to go through what we called the Blueprint Approved Institute. It was 3 months of deep capacity building, so 12 hours a month, of really looking at grant management, minor evaluation, pre and post testing, right? What does it mean to evaluate your work? How are you baking in a public health approach to what you're doing? How are you using social media, right? But really thinking through how they could build their capacity to do their work well. We issued a micro grant to each of those organizations for $6,000 over the summer. So small dollars really on the grand scheme of things, but a lot of money for agencies that have never received money before to demonstrate their work, to show that they could do something meaningful over the summer. And then in the fall, we helped them to evaluate and review what they had done and to develop a PowerPoint presentation so that they could go and pitch to philanthropic partners in the county and others what they were capable of, what they had learned, and what they had produced as a part of that project. And we continued to grow that work. And in the years after George Floyd was murdered, our city did deeper investment, and now that model is seeing 24 agencies each year, doing 2 cycles, so 12 starting in the spring and 12 starting in the fall, really looking at the smallest grassroots organizations, usually organizations with under a $20,000 budget, some with a 0 budget, but really using those people's brilliance to build out what they want to see happen in their communities, and then also using them as a pipeline to work with our evidence-based models. So if we can build their capacity through the capacity building program, then they can become the credible messengers in violence interruption. They can become the support and outreach folks for GVI. They can work on our hospital-based intervention programs, as well as maintaining their own small nonprofit that's serving community. And so really thinking outside of the box and thinking about how we can leverage existing city resources to serve this population has been so core to building the brilliance in Minneapolis. And I'm trying to bring that here to John Jay, and particularly to the National Network for Safe Communities. So much of that work has historically been thought of as anchored in law enforcement, and I think it hasn't always been that way, but that's the way that it's been interpreted. And a lot of my focus is on how are we building. GVI is intended to be a 3-pronged approach that includes law enforcement, social services, and community working together to address the issue of violence. And so really wanting to build out the understanding of what those community partners' role is, and what does support and outreach look like? What are those credible messengers doing? How do we get government to value not only the law enforcement aspect of public safety, but what community brings to the table and the role of social services and credible messengers to create this ecosystem that we're talking about when it comes to safety, so that people can get this robust experience, right, that allows them to back away from violence before law enforcement becomes the heavy, right? And protect the credibility of the people on the ground doing the work, because I think so often when law enforcement is involved, our communities feel like they're being co-opted. Right. And we don't want programs that do that. And so a big part of my work is making sure that we're protecting those credible messengers in the work while also protecting the integrity of law enforcement investigations, because we do want to be safe. Right. And if removing people from community is the only way that that can happen, then we have to do what we have to do, but we operate under the motto of safe, alive, and free, and really in that order. So that's really the capacity that we're trying to build.
Thank you. That is a wonderful example of how you've done it in Minneapolis. A quick advertisement that we're trying to learn from this example and do something similar on the federal side with CVI. We're not doing it directly, but again, by competing for the intermediaries, the larger nonprofits that have the credibility and the capacity to work with and identify the smaller community-based organizations, to pass through those dollars and then give them technical assistance to make them stronger CVI organizations in their communities. Thank you for your example. That is open now, though. So if you are one of those organizations, please take a look. The bigger ones, the intermediaries. All right, Fatima, I'm going to come to you. We've got 10 minutes, I'm told, before we open it up. So we'll do one more round of questions for kind of 2 minutes. And of course, I'm going to ask you a very large question. You are one of the technical assistance providers for the DOJ CVI initiative, and you are a partner in the White House network for the first CVI, the 16-city effort. So you've got a really unique view of what the needs of the field are. So what do you think is the biggest area of either challenge or opportunity in growing the CVI field?
Okay, in 2 minutes or less. Okay, I'll do my best. So there are a couple of things that keep me up at night, and it's related to this question. The first is, it's important to know, and many of you do because you do this work, that this work has been happening for decades and has been neglected for decades. And so there's been hockey stick growth, right, in interest and commitments. So deeply appreciative of the Department of Justice for listening and creating grants that are informed by community so that they can really reflect what we need. But this just happened yesterday, right? And so what happens when you go from neglect, lots of resources? Well, expectations change. People are like, great, and you're gonna solve violence in 2 minutes. Well, this didn't happen overnight, and it's not gonna, right? We have to, if we talk about ecosystem, we've got to build the infrastructure for it, right? You know, when, the subway system, when they're building it, takes years and years and years, right? Just to lay down the track, right? We all know when, so-and-so stop for a couple years. That's what it takes, patience, right? It takes patience to recognize we've got to build this, and it's got to be data-driven. It's got to be informed by community. All those values take time. Okay, so that on the one hand, it takes time. On the other hand, my fear is hundreds of millions of dollars, and somehow they don't touch the actual folks. You know what I'm talking about, the actual folks that we're talking about. It is very, very difficult for us to actually get to those who are at the very, very, very highest risk. And I'm gonna be frank with y'all, we're among friends here, right? In our hospital-based work, we see thousands, tens of thousands of, hundreds of thousands of cases of violence each year at different levels of risk. That's the reality, or different levels of risk. And I wish I could tell you that we could serve every single one of them in the same way, but we have limited resources. We have limited resources. And until we can scale to serve everybody, we have to triage, right? We have that concept in healthcare. How do you triage? How do you figure out? Well, we don't have very sophisticated systems for that. And so my fear is, with all this funding and all this, desire to do the right thing, we miss the opportunity to get really deep with the folks who need it the most, the folks where we really got to wrap up in love consistently, right? I don't want to see programs that are screening out people who are justice involved. We've seen that. Absolutely unacceptable, right? So we have to build the sophistication of our systems. And so one thing that we've done with the same group of organizations that supported the White House initiative is we've launched the Coalition to Advance Public Safety, CAPS. And part of that, these are other technical assistance providers, Cities United, who's in the House, the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, and the Community-Based Public Safety Collective, is we have worked on essentially an algorithm that says, if you've, given your population, given your homicide rate, the high-risk population is small, right? To Sam's point, small. And here are the kinds of staffing you need in your city to do this work. And this is how much it's gonna cost. And what's fascinating is cities will come to us and say, well, we're spending all the money, you know? And then we say, well, how many staff do you have doing this? And they're like, oh, we have only 2 people. Then you're not spending the money on the right stuff, right? We have a great mentoring program in middle school. Well, that's not gonna solve what we're talking about. So it's like we've gotta continue to build these tools that continue to make the point, this is what we're talking about, over and over and over again. And it's not enough to say we have a hospital-based program. At the Javi, we've developed standards, right? 43 standards across 8 domains to really make it clear what we mean by hospital-based violence prevention. Same with, right, cure violence and mediation work. We have to make sure we are clear what we mean so that as we replicate our work, as we continue to get resources, we're learning really what works, and promulgating, we're putting out there those insights. And I believe the programs that the DOJ's constructed are doing that, which is very exciting. But it's gonna take time. We have to continue to fight for them in the long term.
Eddie has been certainly focusing on some of the same points, but I thank you for your candor and your precision. It's gonna help us all be better. I'm gonna ask UAT a different version of this with your newish mayor's, the gun violence prevention SAR. No pressure, AT. But what lessons are emerging that you think will inform the CVI models around the country?
Well, I think the lessons that we're learning has actually been lessons that, really things that we already knew existed. And it's really nothing new. The neighborhoods from which we are zeroing in on are neighborhoods who have been suffering with this issue for so many years and decades. And so at the core of these issues are the same problems. And if you really want to get to resolve those issues, you have to invest in the core issues, the things that the communities are focusing on. So what we're looking at it is so how do we resource our way out of it, right? Just if there's a fire and it's growing, you have to pour water on it. And if it continues to grow, you have to pour more water on it. And so in this case, if we're looking at gun violence as the problem, we have to pour more solutions on it. That's been said by my panelists that you save so much more money in the long run by investing in the issue in the front end. And so one of the things that we are really looking at is how do we continually just resource our way. There's this concept in public safety called precision policing. Well, what we've introduced is precision resourcing, right? If in fact there's a small proportion of people in the community that are being targeted, that are the drivers of crime, then why aren't we zeroing in on that same community, a small number of individuals, and seeing how we can help best help those individuals? A lot of the investigation that takes place are years in the making before they can have a sound case against these individuals, most of which is when these kids, and I say kids because that's what they are, with children. And so if we are identifying and seeing that there's young people who are potentially going to be the perpetrators of future crimes, then why aren't we investing in them when they're young? And so by going into these neighborhoods unapologetically, using the individuals who we've described in this room today that are the best ones who can carry these resources into the crevices of the neighborhoods and pour those resources and make sure that those resources are making its way right down to the bottomest of the so-called pit, that then this is when we begin to start realizing and seeing change. And as has been demonstrated, and I'm so impressed with the statistics out of Richmond, that in fact, if we did that and we were more sincere about it, and if we were consistent about it, we will begin to start seeing the difference that we are all looking for. I mean, there's so many individuals here in this room alongside myself who are testaments of that. When you make that investment in individuals who are been there and done that, communities that have been stricken with these issues for so long, you will begin to start seeing a change. People want to change. Unlike what people may want to believe in popular demand, is that neighborhoods that are violent want to live in that condition. They are so furthest from the truth. There's nobody that wants peace more than the people who live in those neighborhoods. But the resources have to make their way into those neighborhoods. And I get it, it's not for everybody. Everyone may not be the individuals who are willful to want to go in. And this is, again, where we come in at. In fact, you can go in, but so far. And that's, I believe, the resources in a lot of city governments are already in the agencies' coffers, right? There's cities of billions of dollars that they proportion or they spend to be distributed. But they don't make their way in. There is a blood clot. There is something that's in the pipeline that's preventing that resource from going in. So this is where, again, where we come in at, because we can be the carriers to take it in there, and if you train them up right, properly, and you give them the right direction, they will take that resource and give it to those families and those neighborhoods that need it the most. And those families will take advantage of it, and they will benefit from it, and then they will become the change agents and examples that we're all looking for. And this is something that can spread like wildfire. So I don't think it's any nuance. I think it's something that we all know. We just have to be committed as a nation and to commit to making sure that those monies are earmarked and that they're carried in to those communities as fast as we possibly can.
Thank you. Relentless engagement, right? Relentless engagement, to quote our friends at ROCA. We're supposed to go to Q&A, but we're going to do 2 quick questions for you. This is really not fair, Sam, because it's not a quick question also, but Eddie recently joined one of your staff retreats and heard so many stories from your fellows that were so moving about how their lives were changed. And of course, now they're out there helping others, just as AT is describing. Can you share one of those stories?
Well, I mean, I think it's unfair to share someone else's story, to be completely honest. But what I will say is, collectively, if a young person is talking about what we've done for them, we've created a healthy family. I mean, it's bottom line. Help you get into college, graduate FAMU, get into barber school, get into truck driving school, help you do the paperwork to get custody of your child or joint custody, because she doing the baby mom. If you ain't with me, you can't see your kid. Just letting them know, everybody else has neglect. The only people that are paying the folks I'm talking about attention is the ops and the police. Yeah. That's it. And so when they're getting healthy, loving, caring attention from a man with no ulterior motive, just your well-being is my well-being, your success is my success. And it doesn't go anywhere. Everybody speaks on Richmond. I challenge you all not to judge other jurisdictions to Richmond too harshly. This is 15, 16 years in the making. I've been with this office for 15 years. Like, the community knows me. I've built my reputation. I've built my trust. I've built the relationships in the community that needed to be built so that I can have a say-so when somebody's going to, I can sit there and say, I can't talk you out of killing dude. I know it. There's no way in the world. If you see him, you're going to kill him. So my job is to try to make sure you don't see him. Like, you ain't never going to change everything. Your role is to minimize, and just be like, okay, well, you got to promise me nobody but him. Not his brother, not his cousin, not somebody in the community down, none of that. And so, and then, you know what? 4, 5, 6 years done went by. Y'all ain't never seen each other. Now you can graduate from Barber College. Now you can graduate from FAMU. Now you can try to buy your first house. So we create a family and somebody that they know will never turn their back on them no matter what they do.
Thank you for sharing that, Sam. Sasha, we're in a place of higher learning. I know that in Minneapolis, you brought an evaluator in-house to work with you all. Can you share an insight or two from that experience?
Yeah, I'll be really brief. In most cases, we're working with government, we're working with academia, and if it's not written down, it's not real, right? I mean, I'll be honest in saying institutions are anchored in white supremacy, and white supremacy likes writing, right? Like, they like everything to be written down. People of color are often, we're oral historians. We don't necessarily always document things in that way, but that's the society we live in, and so we need to be mindful of that, because if we can't prove what we did, it doesn't matter, right? It matters on the ground, but it doesn't matter when we're applying for money, when we're trying to tell our stories in these kinds of settings, right? And so bringing in an evaluation person into our department became critical, also because how we tell our stories is really important, right? Shootings are gonna go up and down sometimes in ways that we can't control. What we can control are the people we touch, right? So we wanna be able to tell those stories and not just Yes, did they graduate from FAM? Did they buy a house? Those are long-term stories, right? But we want to be able to tell, did they get re-injured by violence? Are they on probation or parole? Did they get a probation violation because of involvement with gun violence? You know, these are tangible things that we can be looking at on a regular basis to say, if this small percentage of people are 100 times statistically more likely to be impacted by gun violence, and only 5 of them out of 400 in Minneapolis have been killed by gun violence, we're doing something right, right? So these are numbers we need to be able to tell because they tell the story of why the investment is worth it. And that's why having an evaluator in Minneapolis felt really important.
We are opening it up for questions. If you have a question, we'll try to get you a mic, and if you can introduce yourself briefly and then ask the question. And I'm going to start right there. Yeah, let's do that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for the work that you're doing. I'm impressed and inspired, and I am writing down notes as you speak. But I wanted to just kind of, Fatima, you spoke on a lot of the sort of thoughts that I have in my mind. There's a book called Toxic Charity. And basically that book talks about how we have to empower the people that we're serving, right? And you kind of touched on that. You know, I always thought about why the people that are being harmed the most can't serve themselves, right? People have to come in and save them, and I'm bothered by that. So me as a Black woman and the work that we do to serve people going through environmental justice issues, specifically water, I wanted to know if you guys, any of you, are focused on environmental justice in the work that you do, because to be honest, all of this work intersects, and it's important that we're working across, like you mentioned, that we're working together collectively and building on all of the ideas and models that work so that we can get to that promised land, right? So I wanted to know if you guys, and if so, which ones?
Specifically gun violence. Like I want to laser focus, but because we've been so effective at that, and once again, I will never take credit. When gun violence goes up, it's not my decision. It's the decision of young people dealing with a conflict in a negative, unhealthy way. When it goes down, it's them same young folks dealing with that conflict in a healthy way. So they get the credit, and don't come looking at me trying to blame me if it goes up. It's their fault. They're the ones doing it. But because it's gone down so much, and they've invested so much into our office, and always data driven, so we looked at the shootings and homicides from the last couple years, and they gave me 9 new outreach workers. Office is bigger than it's ever been, with violence down as low as it's ever been. And so now we have to start looking outside of the box, start getting creative. Historically in Richmond, it's Black-on-Black violence. 85 to 87% of all victims and suspects were African American. We focused on that. When you go down to 11 homicides, you know, the 5 Hispanics that would normally die every year, but would be 6, 8, 10% of your numbers are now 50%. So you're looking at a difference. So we're going into the Latin community. We're engaging women for the first time because, you know, there hasn't been women shooters in our community, but they drive violence. How they do things, playing both sides against the middle, you know, all those things. So we're looking at it in a much more holistic and bigger approach. We're putting folks in schools now because we don't want our community to justify putting police back in schools.
If I may, well, my connection to, and if I'll let someone else speak, but there is a connection, a deep connection or an association of lead poisoning and violence, right? So that has to do with environmental justice, right? When we're talking about being poisoned in water. If you look at Flint, Michigan, Jackson, Mississippi, those places, even Chicago, Newark, those places are heavy in crime. But if you also look at the fact that they have environmental justice issues with their water also affects so many other things. Just wanted to kind of let you know.
Yeah, well, we got Chevron right there, so I know all about that. And North Richmond, right next to Chevron, everybody has asthma. I can only imagine what environment does to create and cause violence. I'm working from the back end. I know there's all kind of folks who do work around the environment in our community, but we are not connected whatsoever.
I'm going to suggest we get 3 real quick questions in a row, and then we'll answer what we can. I've got one here, and one here, and one there, and we have to, of course, Carol. So if you can just stand up, ask a quick question, then we'll answer.
Peace. I'm here, Demetrius Emilian, Community Capacity Development, based in New York. We had an opportunity to work with the Civic as a Core 5 member in Minneapolis also. When we talk about the future of what we say, when we talk about partnership, the standardization of language in our work, do you see that as something that's important when we start to establish ourselves as agencies, like the police have their language, like the fire department has their language, like the hospital has their language? Does community violence prevention work need standardized language to further proceed as far as how we grow this? When we talk about sophisticating what we do.
We're going to get a couple more questions in before we answer. Go ahead. There, I'll give.
Hello and good day, everyone. My name is Jeremy Arce. I'm better known as Brother Curly. I'm also from Man Up Incorporated, and I've been doing this work for about 8, going on 10 years soon. And the thing that bugs me out is that I know that when I go back into my community and I tell the shooter about the day that I had today and the experience that I had, I'm definitely pleasured and honored to be here to receive all this information and to be part of the conversation around solutions versus, always crying about the problems. What do we do to get the shooters in this type of setting and into this type of room to be part of what we're talking about and to be able to, have that hands-on experience and shake hands with people that have been through what they've been through and been able to get to the point where you guys are sitting in the chairs that you're sitting in? Because, like Brother Mitchell said, when we were in the streets and we were doing that, we really, wish that we didn't have to live that lifestyle. So I'm going right back out there to tell them what we did today. I'm going to show them the pictures. I'm going to shake their hands with them, and I'm going to invite them to the next time that I come. But I want to know what advice can we all have and give each other to make sure that we bring the shooters to the room next time we come together.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Dixon. I'm a survivor. My son was murdered in front of me in 2014, and that's when I got into this work. My organization is called Where Do We Go From Here? My question is, there's a lot of funding going out there, but when we lose our children and the media leaves, we are left behind. I started my organization off my retirement check, and it's very hard for me to get funding. I offer court support, I help with burial funding, I have a connection with the Queens District Attorney's Office. I also give healing retreats, healing circles. And when we can't get the money to help these families heal, because see, the numbers of the gun violence can go down, but these parents, and like myself, we're gonna suffer for the rest of our lives. So my thing is, I wanna see more funding and more focus also on survivors, because the survivors are the broken ones.
I think all this relates back together. The question that I have for all of us to be thinking about is, you're doing fabulous work. And I know there's some judges in the room, but every now and then, you're gonna have it continue to happen, and we need to stay focused on the work. So what advice do you have to get people to understand the long-term commitment to this? And that I loved your characterization, Sam, that, they just had an unhealthy approach to dealing with the conflict. You're gonna have a couple of those every now and then. So how do we stay focused and not let that story become the narrative and the story instead of the successes?
Thank you. So what we're going to do, we need to close it. So why don't we just go down for quick responses, and then we'll stay down here for a few minutes.
These are huge questions. I'm gonna just try to take one, right? Sister Carol, thank you so much for your question. In Minneapolis, one of the things that we did with American Recovery Act dollars was create what we called a community trauma response protocol that was really designed to do much of what you're talking about, to fund agencies to support families and communities after an event with violence. I think so often where survivors go gets lost in the shuffle. I think hospital-based work does a lot around that, but as a survivor myself, when I didn't know what to do, right? And I was, well situated. I had insurance and all of the things, but we don't get the support that we need. And so I think baking it in, again, to offices of violence prevention isn't necessarily the place to go because they're doubled down. But the counties often can play a really critical role, and holding the DA's office, I think, is a place where that work often lives and should be more robustly funded in that place for survivors.
I'm gonna take you, brother, your answer, and of course you bring them, just like you said. Like you just said, that's the response. That's the answer. You bring them. Amy was talking about her colleague Eddie. Eddie was with us in San Diego in April, and we had 2 panels of fresh youngsters, and then the ones at 8, 9 years, and so folks could see the difference going through it, what it can look like at the end, and realizing they still going through it too. So, but not only, you bring them, you make them be involved. Anytime you have something that's talking about someone, they should definitely be involved, which is why I wasn't gonna tell nobody else's story. If you wanted to hear that person's story, you should have flew him out here. So, but you get them involved. You bring them, you translate for them. That's your role.
Can I couple or add to that? I would reverse the curse, right? And say, why don't we bring this to them? Because if we're gonna sit and wait for them to come to this, that's gonna take some while, and it's gonna take some overhaul. And we are successful, we can bring some, but oftentimes when I say precision resource, and I'm meaning just that, we know where the problem areas are, where they lack the resources. And so we need to bring resources into those communities. Things like this is what gun violence prevention looks like. If the neighborhood would woke up this afternoon and seen all of us in their community, in itself, they would have asked you the question, what's going on? What's happening over there? And we would have invited them into it. They would have been a part of it. They would have been filling in some of these empty seats, and we would have had an opportunity for them to be a part of it. See, we have to reverse the tradition of how this work is carried out. And again, we are expecting for people, they're not coming downtown. They're not doing that. A lot of them can't get on a train or a bus just like we are able to do to date because of their safety concerns. And so if we know exactly where they coexist, where their habitat, where they live, then we need to partner with the community. We need to partner with the organizations inside those communities that have the best touch point with these individuals, that can invite them to just come outside their doors into a community center or sort and really have this conversation with them. And I'm telling you, it would be a game changer. It will make a big difference. And as it relates to my brother, he was speaking about the language that we do speak our own language, right? And we have our own ways and means of communicating. And I see this sector growing. I see our sector growing to that degree where we won't even have to be labeled a public safety, organization or public health, but in fact, we'll be our own, sector in this space where we will have to be the ones that write that dictionary in terms of what our language look like and what it sounds like.
Let me add to that about the standardization question. Absolutely, right? We do need that, but we need to, there's so much, I won't say healing work that we have to do as practitioners. We have spent a lot of time doing our work, a lot of turf, because we haven't had the resources. We've competed for a long time, and there's, and we've adopted different ways of doing the work that are compelling and powerful. So standardization can feel like you're making me invisible, and I don't want to be invisible. We want standardization to mean our field is maturing, but we got to listen to and account for the harm of having so much neglect. I believe that, we could snap our fingers and write down a bunch of definitions. That doesn't mean we standardize the field. Standardization comes from, it's an evolutionary step in a field that needs to actually be better bonded together. So the convenings we have are healing for us. We do this work, right? We have to attend to that too. We have to be honest with one another, right, about the places in which we didn't show up for one another, right? We were competing. We were, that's my client. No, that's my client. No, we have to really, so there's a lot of work, I think, underneath standardization, but it is, I think, an achievement we can have that's like authentic, that's coming from here, and be proud of what we put out as these are the common things that we share. These are the values we have in this work, and we want more people to be invited in, because standardization allows more people to see themselves, right? Like my sister here, I see myself reflected in this. That's my work, right? And here's the funding stream that reflects my work, and I believe that is where we can be.
Well, these are challenging moments, but I'm so hopeful about our future. The leaders that we have here and out in the field are really bringing such insights to this work and seeding this ecosystem. We're going to be patient, Fatima. We're going to build it together. Thank you all so much for being here.
Just take a quick shot, everyone, real fast, please. Yes. Stand against the wall, please. I'm gonna move these chairs out the way. Right this wall right here.
Thank you. I will tell you that